You expect me to believe you live here?
Yes, this is my house. My ID is in my back pocket.
Yeah? Funny how nobody around here knows you.
I just moved in this morning.
You don't just move in here, not without someone noticing.
My daughter is inside. She's
Then maybe you should have thought about that before trying.
At 11:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning in the gated community of Prescott Ridge, a white woman dialed 911 and reported a break-in in progress. She described the suspect as a black female, acting erratic, possibly armed, moving boxes out of a residence on Wyndham Lane. She used the phrase, "she doesn't belong here," twice during the call. Police arrived 7 minutes later with lights, sirens, and weapons drawn. The woman they surrounded on the front lawn was not a burglar. She was Judge Denise Ayanna Carter, newly appointed to the United States District Court for the Western District of North Carolina, confirmed by the Senate just 3 weeks earlier. She was carrying a box of her daughter's books. Her 10-year-old, Naomi, was watching from inside the house through the living room window. Within minutes, Denise was face down on her own freshly laid sod, wrists cuffed behind her back, a knee pressed into her spine, while her daughter screamed from behind the glass.
The 911 caller watched from her porch with her arms crossed. She never flinched. What none of them knew yet, not the caller, not the officers, not the HOA president who had quietly made this neighborhood her personal checkpoint, was that within 72 hours, federal investigators would be pulling phone records, body cam footage, and HOA emails. Careers would be destroyed, criminal charges would be filed, and the woman they had just put on the ground would be sitting on the federal bench, presiding over the very type of case they had just created. Prescott Ridge sat 6 miles outside Charlotte, North Carolina, behind a stone wall and a wrought iron gate that opened only with a resident code or a guard's approval. The home started at $1.2 million. The lawns were edged weekly by contracted crews who were let in through the service entrance and expected to leave by 4 p.m. There was a clubhouse, a private pool, and a quarterly newsletter that featured recipes, landscaping tips, and reminders about community standards. On paper, it was one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the region. In practice, it had never had a black homeowner. Not once in 26 years. That wasn't an accident. It was a culture. The Homeowners Association, led by its long-serving president Karen Langford, 58, a retired real estate broker with a firm smile and a tighter grip on the neighborhood than any board member before her, had spent years building an invisible fence far more effective than the iron one at the entrance. Under her leadership, police had been called to Prescott Ridge 14 times in the past 3 years for suspicious individuals. Every single one involved a person of color. A black landscaper was questioned for 25 minutes while his white employer watched from her porch without saying a word. A Latino delivery driver was followed by a resident in an SUV from the gate to his stop and back again. A black real estate agent showing a listing to a qualified buyer was held at the gate for 40 minutes while Karen personally called the listing office to verify authorization. None of these incidents were ever formally reported. None were challenged. No one filed a complaint because no one in Prescott Ridge saw a problem. That was the neighborhood Judge Denise Ayanna Carter had just moved into, and it was the neighborhood that was about to learn what happens when the person you try to push out has the full weight of the federal government behind her. Denise Ayanna Carter was not born into the world that Prescott Ridge represented. She grew up in Sandtown, Winchester, one of Baltimore's poorest neighborhoods, in a 2-bedroom apartment with her mother Gloria and 2 younger siblings. Gloria worked double shifts as a hospital custodian and still couldn't always make rent. There were nights the power went out. There were weeks groceries ran thin. But Gloria Carter had one rule that never bent. You will study. You will read. You will become something they can't take from you. Denise listened. She graduated valedictorian from a public high school with a crumbling gymnasium and no AP courses. A full scholarship took her to Spelman College. Another took her to Howard University's School of Law, where she graduated top of her class. She clerked for a federal appellate judge on the 4th Circuit, then joined the Department of Justice as a civil rights prosecutor. For 12 years, she built cases against police departments that profiled, brutalized, and discriminated. She prosecuted officers who used badges as weapons. She sued housing authorities that redlined black families out of neighborhoods exactly like Prescott Ridge.
She knew the law. She knew the patterns. She knew how power worked when no one was watching. When the president nominated her to the federal bench, she became one of the youngest black women ever appointed to a U.S. district court. The Senate confirmed her, 58-42. She purchased the house on Wyndham Lane because she wanted her daughter, Naomi, to grow up somewhere safe, with good schools and open space. That Saturday morning, wearing jeans and a Howard University sweatshirt, she carried boxes from a moving truck into her new home. She had no idea her neighbor was already watching. Karen Langford had seen the moving truck pull onto Wyndham Lane at 9:15 a.m. She noticed it from her kitchen window while pouring her second cup of coffee. When a black woman stepped out of the cab and began unloading boxes, Karen set the cup down and didn't pick it up again. She watched for 20 minutes. She studied the woman's movements, the way she walked back and forth between the truck and the front door, the way she paused on the porch and looked around. To anyone else, it was a person moving into a new home. To Karen, it was a threat. She picked up her phone and called Linda Greaves, 2 houses down. Did you know someone was moving into the Wyndham house? Linda didn't. Karen called Paul Fenton across the street. Same answer. No one had heard. No one had been told. In Karen's mind, that absence of information was confirmation enough. She had told 3 different neighbors over the past month that she hoped the Wyndham property would go to the right kind of family. She never defined what that meant. She never had to. At 11:38 a.m., Karen dialed 911. The transcript would later be entered into federal evidence. There's a black woman at 4912 Wyndham Lane. She's going in and out of the house. I don't think she lives here. She's acting erratic, looking around like she's casing the place. I think she might be armed. I saw something in her waistband. She doesn't belong here. The object in Denise's waistband was a tape measure she had tucked there while measuring the front door frame for a new screen door. Karen used the phrase, "she doesn't belong here," twice during the call. The dispatcher classified it as a burglary in progress with a possibly armed suspect. 2 patrol units were sent, lights and sirens. Officer Wade Prescott was 43 years old with 18 years on the force and a personnel file thick enough to warrant its own drawer. 7 complaints of excessive force. 3 allegations of racially biased stops. All dismissed. All buried under internal review processes that treated civilian complaints like paperwork to be filed, not problems to be solved. Prescott had never been suspended, never been reprimanded in writing, never faced a single consequence for any of it. He had learned over nearly 2 decades that complaints disappeared and badges didn't. His partner that morning was Officer Danny Lucero, 29, 4 years on the job. Lucero was quiet, agreeable, and had never once questioned a senior officer's judgment on a call. He followed. That was his role, and he had never been given a reason to reconsider it. When the dispatch came through at 11:45 a.m., the call was coded as a burglary in progress, possibly armed suspect, residential neighborhood. Prescott pulled the cruiser out of a gas station lot and hit the lights. Lucero checked his sidearm. Neither officer ran the address through property records. Neither checked the county assessor database, which would have shown the home had been purchased 3 weeks earlier by Denise A. Carter. They didn't look at the mailbox when they arrived, which already bore her name in neat black letters. They pulled the cruiser directly onto the front lawn, tires cutting into fresh sod, and exited with weapons drawn. Denise was standing on the front porch holding a cardboard box labeled Naomi's Books in black marker. She looked up and saw 2 officers pointing service weapons at her chest. Behind her, through the living room window, her 10-year-old daughter Naomi stood frozen, watching her mother stare down the barrels of 2 guns. Prescott shouted first, "Drop it! Hands where I can see them! Get off the porch! Now!" Denise set the box down slowly, her hands rising to shoulder height, palms open and facing forward. She kept her voice even. "Officers, my name is Judge Denise Carter. This is my home. I just moved in today. I can show you my identification." Prescott didn't pause. "Sure you are. And I'm the mayor. Step off the porch and get on the ground. Now. Denise stayed calm. Sir, I am a federal judge with the United States District Court. My ID is in my back pocket. My daughter is inside. She's 10 years old. Please don't scare her. Prescott stepped closer, his weapon still raised. I'm not going to ask again. On the ground. Lucero circled to her left, positioning himself behind her, cutting off any path back toward the front door. Denise lowered herself to one knee slowly, still speaking. I'm complying. I'm not resisting. Please, my daughter is watching. Prescott holstered his weapon, grabbed her right wrist, twisted it behind her back, and drove her face first into the lawn. The impact was hard enough to press grass and dirt into the side of her face. He wrenched her other arm back and snapped the cuffs on while planting a knee between her shoulder blades. Inside the house, Naomi screamed. The sound cut through the morning air and reached every porch on the street. Neighbors stepped outside. At least 4 phones began recording. Karen Langford stood on her own porch 15 yards away, arms crossed, watching. She nodded once. Denise spoke into the grass. My daughter is inside, alone. She's 10. Please don't frighten her. Please. Prescott didn't respond. Lucero, without a warrant, without permission, without probable cause, walked to the front door, pushed it open, and entered the home with his weapon drawn. He found Naomi crouched behind the couch, sobbing, her arms wrapped around her knees. He shouted commands at her. Don't move. Where's anyone else? How many people are in this house? She was 10 years old. She could barely breathe through the crying. Lucero radioed in. Minor on the premises. No other suspects. He left her there, alone. He walked back outside to stand over Denise, while Naomi's cries echoed through the open front door for every camera and every neighbor to hear. Naomi Carter had been coloring at the kitchen table when the moving truck arrived that morning. She had helped carry 2 small boxes from the truck to her new bedroom, the one with the big window that looked out onto the backyard. Her mother had promised they would hang curtains together that afternoon. Purple ones. Naomi had picked them out herself. When the sirens hit the street, Naomi moved to the living room window. She saw the police car pull onto the grass. She saw 2 officers get out with their guns pointed at her mother. She didn't understand. Her mother was just standing on the porch holding a box. The box with Naomi's name on it. The one with her books inside. She pressed her hands against the glass. Her breath fogged the window. She couldn't move. She watched Prescott grab her mother's arm and twist it. She watched her mother go down face first into the lawn. She watched a knee press into her mother's back. That was when Naomi screamed. It was the kind of scream that doesn't stop on its own, the kind that comes from a place deeper than fear. Neighbors heard it from their porches. Cell phone recordings captured it clearly, a child's voice breaking over and over, calling for her mother. Then the front door burst open. Lucero came through it with his weapon drawn, even though the door had been unlocked the entire time. He swept the room. He found Naomi behind the couch, curled into herself, arms around her knees, face wet with tears. He pointed his weapon in her direction before lowering it. Don't move. How many people are in this house? She couldn't answer. She was gasping between sobs. Mommy, I want my mommy, please. Lucero didn't kneel, didn't soften his voice, didn't explain why he was there or that her mother was okay. He keyed his radio. Minor on premises. No other suspects found. Then he turned and walked back outside, pulling the door shut behind him. Naomi stayed behind the couch for 15 minutes, alone, in a house she had lived in for less than 3 hours. She could hear voices outside, but not her mother's. She didn't know if her mother was hurt. She didn't know if her mother was coming back. The neighbor videos captured what the body cameras missed, the sound of a child crying through an open window, calling for a mother who was face down in handcuffs 12 feet away and not allowed to answer. Gerald Forsyth had moved to Prescott Ridge 8 years earlier after retiring from a 40-year career in civil litigation. He was 72, white-haired, and had spent most of his adult life in courtrooms. He knew what lawful procedure looked like, and he knew what he was watching from his porch was not it. He had introduced himself to Denise that morning when the moving truck arrived. They had talked for a few minutes. She mentioned she was a judge. He had helped carry a box to the porch. When the officers arrived and put her on the ground, Forsyth didn't hesitate. He walked across the lawn, steady and deliberate, and stopped 6 feet from where Prescott stood over Denise. "Officers, you are making a serious mistake." Prescott barely looked at him. "Sir, step back. This is a police matter." Forsyth didn't move. "This woman is the homeowner. Her name is on the mailbox. Her deed is inside. I have her identification right here." He held up Denise's wallet and a manila folder with the closing documents she had asked him to grab from the kitchen counter. Prescott glanced at the wallet, then back at Forsyth. "We'll handle verification. Step back." Forsyth's voice hardened. "I've known this woman for 2 hours, and I already pulled up her Senate confirmation on my phone." He held the screen up, showing a news article with Denise's photograph in the headline. "She was confirmed by the United States Senate 3 weeks ago. You are handcuffing a sitting federal judge on her own property." Prescott's jaw went slack for half a second. His eyes moved from the phone screen to Denise's face, still pressed against the grass. The photo matched. The name matched. Lucero, standing behind them, went pale. His hand dropped from his belt. For the first time since they had pulled onto the lawn, neither officer moved. Neither spoke. Forsyth lowered the phone. "I suggest you uncuff her immediately and call your supervisor before this gets worse than it already is." Prescott did not uncuff her. He did not apologize. He did not check her ID. Instead, he reached for his radio and keyed the mic. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14. I need a sergeant at 4912 Wyndham Lane. Possible misidentification. Requesting guidance." Denise lay still in the grass, wrists locked behind her back, listening to the man who had just slammed her to the ground ask someone else what to do next. Sergeant Rita Bowman pulled up to 4912 Wyndham Lane 6 minutes after Prescott's radio call. She was 48, a 22-year veteran of the department, and the kind of supervisor who didn't need to raise her voice to make a room go quiet. She stepped out of her cruiser, scanned the scene, and understood immediately that something had gone very wrong. A black woman in handcuffs on a freshly sodded lawn, a moving truck in the driveway, neighbors with phones out, a child's muffled crying from inside the house. Gerald Forsyth met her halfway across the lawn, holding the wallet and the deed folder. He handed her both without a word. Bowman looked at the driver's license first, then the deed, then the news article still open on Forsyth's phone. She looked at Denise on the ground and back at Prescott. "Uncuff her, now." Prescott hesitated. "Sarge, the call said she was possibly armed." "I said uncuff her." Prescott removed the handcuffs. Denise sat up slowly, rubbing the red grooves pressed into her wrists, grass and dirt still on the side of her face. Bowman crouched in front of her. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Rita Bowman. I'm sorry, are you hurt?" "My daughter," Denise said. "She's inside, alone. She's been alone this whole time." Bowman stood, walked to the front door, and went inside. She found Naomi still behind the couch, knees pulled to her chest, face swollen from crying. Bowman sat on the floor beside her. "Your mom is okay. She's right outside. She's coming in to get you, I promise." She stayed with Naomi until Denise walked through the door 2 minutes later. Then Bowman went back outside and turned on Prescott. "What probable cause did you have? He got a burglary call. Did you verify ownership before drawing weapons? Did you check the mailbox? The moving truck has her name on the invoice taped to the door." Prescott said nothing. Bowman pulled both officers' radios and body cameras. She called the precinct captain from the driveway. The captain called the chief. The chief called the city attorney. Within the hour, the Charlotte FBI field office received a formal notification. An assault on a sitting federal judge is a federal crime. And when the DOJ Civil Rights Division opened a file that afternoon, the name on the intake form was familiar to half the office. Denise had worked there for 12 years. Federal investigators pulled the 911 recording within 24 hours. They played it back 4 times in a conference room at the Charlotte FBI field office. Every word was transcribed, time-stamped, and entered into evidence. There's a black woman at 4912 Wyndham Lane. She's going in and out of the house. I don't think she lives here. She's acting erratic, looking around like she's casing the place. I think she might be armed. I saw something in her waistband. She doesn't belong here. Each claim was checked against the facts. Erratic behavior. Denise had been walking boxes from a moving truck to her front door in a straight line for over an hour. Possibly armed. The object in her waistband was a tape measure, visible in both body camera footage and neighbor recordings. Casing the place. She had been measuring her own door frame. She doesn't belong here. She said it twice. Investigators then pulled Karen Langford's history with the department. What they found was not a concerned citizen making a one-time mistake. It was a pattern. 14 calls to police in 3 years. Every single one about a non-white person in the neighborhood. A black landscaper working a scheduled job. A Latino FedEx driver making a delivery. A biracial couple touring a house for sale. All unfounded. All logged. All ignored. Then the HOA email surfaced. Karen had used her position as president to coordinate what investigators would later describe as a neighborhood surveillance network targeting people of color. One email to the board read plainly, "We need to protect the character of this community before it changes." Another instructed residents to report anyone who doesn't look like they live here and let the police sort it out. Federal prosecutors determined that Karen's 911 call was not a misunderstanding. It was a fabrication. A false police report designed to provoke an armed response against an unarmed black woman on her own property. Given the documented pattern of racial targeting, the U.S. Attorney's Office added a federal hate crime charge under 18 U.S.C. Section 249. Karen Langford was arrested on a Tuesday morning, walked out of the same gated entrance she had guarded so carefully, and placed in the back of a federal vehicle. Her HOA presidency was stripped that same week by an emergency board vote. Within a month, her husband filed for divorce, citing in the petition irreconcilable differences rooted in moral disagreement. Karen's attorney released a statement calling the charges an overreach. The 911 recording said otherwise. Internal Affairs opened its investigation before the sun set on Saturday. The body camera footage from both officers was pulled, time-stamped, and logged into the department's evidence system by 4 p.m. A secure copy was sent to the FBI field office by 5. The footage from Prescott's camera began in the cruiser. He and Lucero were driving to the call, lights on, sirens wailing. Prescott glanced at Lucero and grinned. "Bet you $20 it's a crackhead." Lucero laughed. The camera caught it all. The audio was clean. The timestamp was clear. When they arrived, the footage showed Prescott pulling onto the lawn without pausing at the mailbox. It showed him exiting with his weapon drawn before assessing the scene. It showed Denise standing calmly on the porch holding a cardboard box. It captured her voice, steady and clear. "Officers, my name is Judge Denise Carter. This is my home." And it captured Prescott's response. "Sure you are. And I'm the mayor." The footage continued through the takedown, Denise lowering herself voluntarily, Prescott grabbing her wrist, the twist, the shove. Her face hitting the grass, his knee on her back, her voice underneath him. "My daughter is inside. She's 10. Please don't scare her." At no point did Prescott attempt to verify her identity. At no point did he run the address. At no point did he check the deed, the mailbox, or the moving invoice taped to the front door with her full name on it. Lucero's footage confirmed the unlawful entry. No warrant, no exigent circumstances beyond his own assumption. A weapon drawn inside a home where the only occupant was a 10-year-old girl behind a couch. Internal Affairs completed its preliminary findings within 5 days. Prescott was terminated for excessive force, racial bias, failure to follow verification procedures, and conduct unbecoming an officer. His 7 prior complaints were formally reopened. Lucero was terminated for failure to intervene, unlawful entry without a warrant, and traumatizing a minor during an unjustified search. The State Law Enforcement Certification Board opened emergency decertification proceedings against both officers within the week. Neither would ever carry a badge again. Federal prosecutors convened a grand jury to weigh criminal charges: assault on a federal official, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy. The evidence was already in hand. Their own cameras had provided it. The neighbor videos hit the internet by Saturday evening. By Sunday morning, they had been viewed over 2 million times. The image that spread fastest was a still frame pulled from Gerald Forsyth's phone. It showed Denise Carter face down on her own lawn, wrists cuffed behind her back, a white officer's knee between her shoulder blades, while a cardboard box labeled Naomi's Books lay on its side 2 feet away. The caption someone added before sharing read simply, "She's a federal judge. This is her house." That image became the front page of 4 national newspapers by Monday. Cable news ran the story on every cycle. The phrase, "She doesn't belong here," trended for 3 consecutive days. Charlotte erupted. Protests formed outside the police precinct within 48 hours. Not riots, not chaos. Organized groups of citizens holding signs and standing in silence. Teachers, attorneys, doctors, parents with their children. They didn't chant. They held printed screenshots of the body camera footage and the 911 transcript. That silence was louder than any slogan. The mayor held a press conference Monday afternoon. He called the incident deeply troubling and promised a full and transparent review. Civil rights organizations rejected the language immediately. Deeply troubling was what politicians said when they wanted to sound concerned without committing to action. They demanded structural reform, independent oversight, a complete audit of every police call made to Prescott Ridge in the past decade. Investigative reporters delivered that audit before the city could. They pulled public records and discovered that Prescott Ridge had generated 47 police calls about suspicious people of color in 5 years. Every single one was unfounded. Not a single arrest, not a single crime confirmed. 47 calls. 47 people stopped, questioned, followed, or confronted for the crime of being non-white in a wealthy neighborhood. The police chief was asked during a live interview whether he had been aware of the pattern. He hesitated for 4 seconds before answering. That pause was clipped and reshared more than the interview itself. By Wednesday, 3 city council members had publicly called for his resignation. The city attorney's office began preparing for a lawsuit it knew was coming and knew it could not win. The evidence was already public. The body cameras had made sure of that. Judge Denise Ayanna Carter recused herself from any proceeding connected to the incident before filing the lawsuit. She would not sit in judgment of her own case. She would let the system she had spent her career building do its work. Her attorneys filed the complaint in the United States District Court for the Western District of North Carolina on a Thursday morning. The defendant list was long. The City of Charlotte. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. Officer Wade Prescott. Officer Danny Lucero. Karen Langford. The Prescott Ridge Homeowners Association. The allegations filled 64 pages. Unlawful arrest, excessive force, racial profiling, Fourth Amendment violations, assault on a federal official, unlawful entry of a private residence without a warrant, intentional infliction of emotional distress on a minor, conspiracy to deprive civil rights under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, failure to train, supervise, and discipline officers with documented histories of misconduct. The section on Naomi ran 11 pages. Her therapist, Dr. Renee Whitmore, submitted a sworn declaration describing the damage. Naomi had developed recurring nightmares in which officers broke down her door. She refused to be in any room alone. She flinched at sirens. She asked her mother every morning before school whether police would come to their house again. Doctor. Whitmore described it as acute trauma consistent with a child who had been made to believe her parent was being taken from her by force. She was 10 years old. The lawsuit also included a class action component. 47 people of color had been wrongfully targeted by police calls originating from Prescott Ridge over the past 5 years. Each had been stopped, questioned, detained, or forced to leave based on nothing but their appearance. Their names were added to the complaint. Their experiences were documented. They were no longer isolated incidents. They were a pattern. Discovery broke the case open further. Internal police emails showed that supervisors had been aware of the volume of calls from Prescott Ridge for years. One captain had written to a lieutenant 18 months earlier. "We're getting a lot of calls from that gated community. Same type every time. Unfounded." The lieutenant's response was 3 words: respond and document. No investigation was opened. No pattern analysis was conducted. No one asked why every single call involved a person of color. The city's legal team reviewed the body camera footage, the 911 recording, the emails, the class action filings, and the therapist's declaration. Their recommendation to the city council was unanimous and immediate. Settle. Do not take this to trial. You will not win. The settlement was reached 5 months after the lawsuit was filed. The Carter family received $1.8 million in damages. The 47 class action plaintiffs shared an additional $600,000 compensation fund, with individual amounts determined by the severity of each incident. But the money was not the center of the agreement. The mandated reforms were. The city agreed to establish an independent civilian oversight board with full investigative authority over police misconduct complaints. Mandatory verification protocols were implemented for all property-related calls, requiring officers to confirm ownership records, check identification, and make visual assessments before any use of force. Quarterly demographic audits of all police interactions would be conducted and published publicly. The entire department would undergo retraining in implicit bias, de-escalation, and constitutional rights. Body camera compliance would be enforced with a zero-tolerance policy. Any officer who failed to activate their camera during a citizen interaction would face immediate suspension. The criminal cases moved on a parallel track. A federal grand jury indicted Wade Prescott on 2 counts: deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. Section 242, and assault on a federal official. The body camera footage was the prosecution's primary exhibit. His own voice, his own hands, his own knee. The jury deliberated for less than a day, guilty on both counts. The judge sentenced Prescott to 4 years in federal prison. She noted in her remarks that his record of prior complaints demonstrated a pattern the department had chosen to ignore, and that this failure had culminated in the assault of a sitting federal judge on her own property in front of her child. Danny Lucero was convicted of deprivation of rights and unlawful entry. He received 18 months. His attorney argued he had simply followed a senior officer's lead. The judge was unmoved. Following orders is not a defense when the orders are unconstitutional. Karen Langford pleaded guilty to filing a false police report and 1 count of a federal hate crime under 18 U.S.C. Section 249. Her 911 call, her history of targeting, and the HOA emails left no room for a viable defense. She was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. She became the first person in North Carolina convicted under federal hate crime statutes for a weaponized 911 call. Legal analysts called it a landmark. The precedent was set. A phone call made with the intent to provoke an armed police response against a person based on their race was not a misunderstanding. It was a crime. 1 month after the settlement, Judge Denise Ayanna Carter walked into the Charles R. Jonas Federal Building in Charlotte, wearing her judicial robes for the first time. Naomi held her hand. A U.S. Marshal opened the door to her chambers. On her desk sat a drawing Naomi had made during therapy. 2 figures holding hands in front of a house with purple curtains. Denise placed it next to her nameplate and sat down. Her first case that week was a housing discrimination complaint. A black family alleged they had been systematically excluded from a rental property based on race. Denise ruled with a precision her colleagues described as measured but unmistakable. She never referenced her own experience from the bench. She didn't need to. Naomi was still seeing Dr. Whitmore twice a week. The nightmares came less often now. She had made a friend on the street, a girl named Lily, whose family had moved in after the case made national news. They rode bikes in the cul-de-sac where the cruiser had torn up the lawn. New sod covered the tire marks. Karen Langford's house sat empty, a for sale sign in the yard, curtains drawn, no offers. The HOA was dissolved and reformed under new bylaws prohibiting discriminatory reporting. A bronze plaque was installed at the neighborhood entrance. This community welcomes all residents equally. Denise used part of the settlement to establish the Carter Justice Initiative, a nonprofit providing free legal representation to victims of racially motivated false police reports. In its first year, the foundation took on 23 cases across 3 states. She never spoke publicly about what happened on her lawn. When a reporter asked off the record how she felt, she said only this: "I didn't need them to believe I was a judge. I needed them to treat me like a citizen." That should have been enough. They tried to tell her she didn't belong. She belonged more than any of them knew. This case was brutal, but the case on the right spirals completely out of control.
Sir, I stopped you for the damaged taillight. I also need clarification about your relationship with the minors in the vehicle.
They're family friends. I'm driving them home, that's all.
One of them said you're not his father. They're scared, sitting in silence while you're ordering them to stay quiet.
You playing with fire, deputy. You don't understand.
At 11:47 p.m. on a dark stretch of Highway 9 outside Crestfield, Georgia, a 29-year-old patrol deputy named Vanessa Cordero activated her lights behind a black Lincoln Continental drifting between lanes with a broken taillight. She expected nothing. A routine stop on a quiet overnight shift covering for a colleague on leave. The kind of call that usually ended with a warning and a wave. It didn't. The driver lowered his window slowly, already holding his license between 2 fingers, like a man who had done this before and never had to explain himself. He was well-dressed, calm, controlled. He identified himself before she could finish her opening line. Judge Clarence Devereaux, presiding judge of the 14th District Family Court. His voice carried authority, even on the shoulder of a county road at midnight. He told her the taillight had been an ongoing issue, that he was heading home from a family function and that she could let this one go. Cordero noted the tone. Not a request, an instruction. She kept her flashlight steady and moved it past the driver's seat toward the back of the vehicle. 4 children sat in the back, ages roughly 6 to 11. None of them moved. None of them spoke. Their eyes stayed low, fixed on their laps or the seat in front of them. One of them, a small girl in the rear passenger seat, was trembling visibly. Her hands were pressed flat between her knees. Cordero's training told her to note the detail and continue the stop. She did. She asked for registration. Devereaux handed it over without a word, his eyes watching her in the side mirror. She stepped back toward her cruiser, Bodycam recording, flashlight beam cutting across the dark interior of the Lincoln one more time. That was when a boy sitting behind the driver's seat turned his head slowly and looked directly into the lens mounted on her chest. His lips barely moved. "That's not my dad." Judge Clarence Devereaux was 58 years old and had spent 22 of those years on the bench of the 14th District Family Court in Crestfield, Georgia. He was not just a judge in that town, he was an institution. His name appeared on the donor walls of 3 local nonprofits. He gave the keynote address at the county's annual Foster Care Appreciation Dinner every year for over a decade. He had been profiled twice by the Crestfield Herald as a pillar of justice and compassion, a man who had dedicated his career to protecting the most vulnerable children in the system. He ran a mentorship program for youth aging out of foster care, personally selecting participants and meeting with them regularly in his chambers. Local attorneys spoke about him with a mix of respect and caution. His courtroom was strict, his rulings were final, and his influence over custody placements, foster assignments, and juvenile case outcomes was nearly absolute. But beneath the accolades and the authority, there were things people noticed and never said aloud. Court clerks who saw certain children brought to his chambers outside of scheduled hearings. Social workers who were told specific children needed to be placed in homes Devereaux personally recommended. A bailiff who once saw a child leave the judge's office in tears and was told it was a difficult custody conversation. None of it was ever reported. None of it was ever questioned. The attorneys who practiced before him needed his favor. The social workers depended on his rulings. The community trusted his image. And Devereaux had spent 2 decades making sure that image never cracked. Until a deputy on a quiet highway asked the wrong question at the right time, and a boy in the back seat answered it. Officer Vanessa Cordero had never been the type to back down from authority. She was the daughter of a Guatemalan mechanic and a Dominican home health aide who raised 3 children in a 2-bedroom apartment in Macon. She joined the Harmon County Sheriff's Office at 24, not because she came from a law enforcement family, but because of her cousin Sophia. Sophia had been placed in foster care at age 9 and bounced through 4 homes in 2 years. She came back different, quiet in a way that wasn't shyness. Cordero never got the full story. She didn't need to. She understood that the system had failed someone she loved, and she decided she would never be the person who looked the other way when something felt wrong. In 5 years on the job, she had built a reputation that made some colleagues uncomfortable. She once cited a county commissioner for DUI on a back road outside Harmon and refused to void the ticket when his chief of staff called the station. She filed a formal report on a fellow deputy who had roughed up a teenager during a traffic stop, even after being told it would make her unpopular. Her sergeant once described her in a performance review as someone who doesn't care about your title, just your behavior. It was meant as a compliment. Not everyone took it that way. That night, she was working a solo overnight shift on Highway 9. 12 hours, mostly silence, mostly empty road. She had pulled over 2 vehicles before the Lincoln. Both were routine. Both ended in under 5 minutes. When she saw the Continental drifting across the center line with a busted taillight, she expected the same. A warning, a signature, a good night. What she got instead was a man who told her who he was before she asked. 4 children who sat like statues, and a whisper from the back seat that made every nerve in her body fire at once. She didn't drive away from it. She called it in. Cordero walked back to the Lincoln and positioned herself at the rear passenger window. Her flashlight moved across the back seat slowly. The 4 children hadn't shifted since she first approached. The 2 boys sat behind the driver and front passenger seats. The older girl, roughly 11, sat in the middle. The younger girl, the one who had been trembling, was pressed against the far door. Cordero leaned slightly and spoke in a voice low enough that Devereaux would have had to strain to hear. "Hey, you kids doing okay back there?" No one answered. The older girl's eyes flicked toward the driver's seat and then back down. The younger girl's hands were still pressed between her knees. The boy who had whispered moments earlier stared straight ahead now, jaw tight, as if he regretted what he had said. Devereaux's voice came from the front. "Officer, they're tired. It's late. I'm transporting them home from a family gathering. They're foster children in my care." Cordero didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the children. "Do you have paperwork for them? Foster documentation, custody orders, anything with their names?" Devereaux paused for half a second. "Not on me. It's at my home. I'm a family court judge, officer. I don't carry case files in my vehicle." Cordero straightened. She noted the details her training told her to catalog. No seatbelts properly fastened on 3 of the 4 children. The younger girl was not wearing shoes. No booster seat for the smallest child. No documentation of any kind for 4 minors in a vehicle with an unrelated adult approaching midnight. She keyed her radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 17. I need a second unit to my location on Highway 9, mile marker 41. I have a welfare concern involving 4 minors." Devereaux's tone changed. "That's not necessary. I've told you who I am. You can verify it with 1 phone call." Cordero met his eyes through the window. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to stay in the vehicle. I've requested backup. We'll sort this out when they arrive." Devereaux stared at her for a long moment. Then he said something the body cam captured with perfect clarity. You have no idea what you're doing, Deputy. You're going to regret this. Devereaux didn't wait for backup. He pulled out his phone, scrolled with the casual ease of a man who had powerful people on speed dial, and pressed call. Cordero watched from behind the vehicle, body cam recording. Her microphone picked up fragments. His tone shifted from calm to firm. The words "Patrol Deputy," "Highway 9," and "Handled immediately" came through clearly. Within 2 minutes, her radio crackled. Sergeant Ray Loomis, her shift supervisor. "Vanessa, what's your status on Highway 9? She responded, "Welfare concern, 4 minors, no documentation. 1 child made a statement. I've requested backup." A pause. Then Loomis's voice dropped lower. "Listen, the driver is Judge Devereaux. He's known to the department. He sits on the County Public Safety Board. You might want to extend professional courtesy and let him get those kids home." Cordero stared at the Lincoln's rear window. She could see the outline of the older girl's head, motionless. She keyed the radio. "Sergeant, a child told me the driver is not his father. I have 4 minors with no documentation, no proper restraints, approaching midnight. I'm not releasing this vehicle until backup confirms the welfare of these children." Silence. Then Loomis came back. "Copy. Backup en route." Inside the Lincoln, Devereaux adjusted his rearview mirror. The body cam caught the reflection. He was watching the children. The older girl had her hand on the younger one's knee. The boy who had whispered sat rigid, staring straight ahead. Devereaux's expression was composed, but something had shifted behind his eyes. The confidence was still there, but alongside it sat something sharper. He turned slightly toward the back seat and spoke. The microphone picked up only part of it, but digital enhancement during the investigation would later recover the full sentence. "Remember what I told you, not a word." Deputy Terrence Kamal arrived 11 minutes later. He stepped out slowly and walked toward Cordero with the expression of someone who already knew this was complicated. She briefed him in a low voice. Broken taillight, erratic driving, 4 children, no documentation, no shoes on the youngest, a child's whisper, and a driver who identified himself as a sitting judge before she'd asked his name. Kamal listened with his arms crossed. "I know who he is, Vanessa. He's been at department dinners. The sheriff shakes his hand at the courthouse Christmas reception." Cordero didn't blink. "Then you understand why this has to be done right." Kamal looked at the Lincoln, at the dark shapes in the back seat, at the man behind the wheel. "What do you want to do?" She told him. "Ask Devereaux to step out. Request documentation." If he couldn't produce any, they were calling Child Protective Services and a forensic child advocacy officer. Kamal exhaled. "You know what happens if we're wrong." Cordero's response was immediate. "You know what happens if we're right and we drive away." He nodded once. They walked to the Lincoln together. Cordero tapped the window. "Judge Devereaux, I'm asking you to step out of the vehicle." He opened the door slowly, straightening his jacket as he stood. His posture was controlled, expression flat. "This is a mistake," he said. "A serious mistake." Cordero replied without hesitation. "Sir, do you have any legal documentation authorizing you to transport these children?" His silence lasted 3 full seconds. The body cam counted them. "I don't have to explain myself to a patrol deputy. I am a judge of the family court. Those children are under my supervision through a mentorship program I personally administer." Cordero asked one more time. "Paperwork? Names? Case numbers?" He had nothing. Cordero called Child Protective Services at 12:23 a.m. A forensic child advocacy officer named Imani Sutton arrived at the Harmon County Fire Station 40 minutes later. The children were transported separately from Devereaux and brought inside one at a time. Sutton was trained for this. Soft voice, open posture, no uniforms in the room. She started with the boy who had spoken on the highway. His name was Terrell. He was 8 years old. He had been in the foster system since age 4. He told Sutton he was taken from his group home 3 days earlier by a woman he didn't know who said he was going to a special family visit. He said the man in the car told him to call him Sir. He said they stayed in a house with no other adults. He said he didn't want to go back. Sutton moved to the oldest girl, 11 years old. Her name was Kiara. She didn't speak at first. She sat with her arms wrapped around herself, eyes on the floor. When Sutton asked if she had been to the man's house before, Kiara nodded slowly. How many times? Kiara held up 4 fingers. Sutton asked what happened there. Kiara used language that triggered mandatory reporting protocols immediately. A 6-year-old boy in the 3rd interview barely spoke at all. He flinched when a male firefighter walked past the open door. The 4th child, a 7-year-old girl named Amara, didn't answer questions directly. Sutton gave her crayons and paper. She drew a picture of a room with no windows and a large bed. She drew a tall figure standing next to it. Sutton stepped out of the room, closed the door behind her, and called the district attorney's office. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. We need a warrant tonight. A judge from the neighboring district was woken at 2:41 a.m. to sign the warrant. No one in Crestfield's court system could be involved. By 4:15 a.m., a team of investigators from the Harmon County Sheriff's Office and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation entered Devereaux's residence, a well-kept colonial on a tree-lined street in the town's wealthiest neighborhood. The front rooms looked normal. Family photos on the mantel, legal texts on the shelves, awards and framed newspaper clippings on the study wall. The basement told a different story. Behind a locked interior door, investigators found a furnished room with bedding for multiple children, small clothing folded in stacks, personal items belonging to minors, electronic devices concealed in a floor safe, and a ledger-style notebook with entries spanning years, each referencing children by initials, dates, and coded notations that investigators would later decipher with the help of child exploitation analysts. Digital forensics was called in before sunrise. The scope of the investigation expanded within hours. Devereaux was arrested at the scene. He was still wearing the suit from the traffic stop. He said nothing when they put him in handcuffs. His attorney arrived within the hour, demanded to know the charges, and was handed a warrant that ran 4 pages. Outside, the first light of morning broke across Crestfield. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as a man they had admired for 2 decades was guided into the back of a federal vehicle. None of them spoke. None of them yet understood what had been happening inside that house. But the children did. And now, finally, someone had listened. The investigation into how Devereaux operated moved fast once investigators understood what they were looking at. He hadn't acted on impulse. He had built a system. As presiding judge of the 14th District Family Court, Devereaux had direct authority over custody placements, foster assignments, and juvenile case outcomes. For over a decade, he had used that power to position himself as the final word on where vulnerable children ended up. He cultivated relationships with specific social workers who processed his recommendations without question. He maintained ties to 2 group home administrators who flagged children with no stable family connections, the ones least likely to be missed or believed. His mentorship program, celebrated publicly as a model of judicial compassion, served as the pipeline. Children selected for the program were brought to his chambers for meetings that no one supervised. Some were assigned to foster homes connected to people he controlled. Court records later showed that Devereaux had personally intervened in the placement of at least 19 children over 7 years, overriding caseworker recommendations in 12 of those instances. Each time, the reassignment moved the child closer to his reach. The social workers who facilitated it fell into 2 categories. Some were manipulated, pressured by the authority of a judge they couldn't afford to cross. Others knew. They looked the other way because Devereaux controlled their caseloads, their courtroom outcomes, and in some cases, their careers. One social worker would later testify that she had raised the concern once and was told by her supervisor to drop it. The supervisor's explanation was brief. He's a judge. You're not. That was the end of it. When news of Devereaux's arrest reached the Crestfield legal community, the silence was immediate and telling. Attorneys who had practiced before him for years offered no comment. 2 social workers connected to his cases were placed on administrative leave within 48 hours. The director of the county's Child Welfare Office submitted a resignation letter with no public explanation. A local journalist named Franklin Cobb, who had twice profiled Devereaux as a community hero, began receiving anonymous tips within days. Former court staff, foster parents, a retired bailiff who said he once saw a child leave the judge's chambers crying and was told not to ask about it. Cobb published his first investigative piece within 2 weeks. It detailed 3 formal complaints filed against Devereaux over the previous decade with the state's Judicial Conduct Board. All 3 had been dismissed after what the board described as preliminary review. One of the complainants was a foster mother named Gloria Vance. She had reported concerns about a child's behavior after visits connected to the mentorship program. She described nightmares, withdrawal, language that alarmed her. She was told she was being alarmist. 6 months later, her foster license was revoked on a paperwork technicality. She lost custody of 2 children she had been raising for 3 years. Vance told Cobb she had always believed the revocation was retaliation. Now, reading the charges against Devereaux, she was certain. The system didn't fail those children by accident, she said. It failed them because it protected him. When the article ran, the Judicial Conduct Board issued a statement announcing an internal review. By then, the FBI was already in Crestfield. The FBI and Department of Justice opened a joint federal investigation 9 days after the traffic stop. What began as a single incident on Highway 9 had expanded into something the U.S. Attorney's Office described internally as systemic and predatory. Federal agents seized Devereaux's electronic devices, court records, personal correspondence, and financial statements. Digital forensics uncovered encrypted files and communications with individuals in 2 neighboring states. Financial records showed a pattern of payments to the group home administrators who had funneled children into placements Devereaux controlled. The money was structured in small amounts, routed through a nonprofit Devereaux had established under the umbrella of his mentorship program. On paper, the funds were labeled as youth enrichment grants. In practice, they were payments for access. Federal prosecutors convened a grand jury within 3 weeks. The indictment, when it came, was 34 counts: trafficking, exploitation, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, wire fraud connected to the nonprofit, civil rights violations under color of law. 2 social workers and 1 group home administrator were named as co-conspirators. Devereaux was denied bail. His attorney, a high-profile defense lawyer from Atlanta, called it a rush to judgment driven by media pressure. The U.S. attorney held a brief press conference outside the federal courthouse. She stood behind a podium with no notes and spoke directly into the cameras. This office has investigated many cases involving abuse of power. This is among the most disturbing. A sitting judge used the institution designed to protect children as a tool to exploit them. We will pursue accountability at every level. Devereaux watched the press conference from a federal holding facility on a wall-mounted television. According to a corrections officer who was present, he showed no reaction. He sat with his hands folded, expression blank, staring at the screen as if watching someone else's life collapse. The federal trial began 4 months later and lasted 5 weeks. The courtroom was full every day. Prosecutors opened with the Bodycam footage from Highway 9. The jury watched in silence as the Lincoln Continental rolled to a stop on the dark shoulder. They heard Cordero's voice, calm and professional. They saw the children's faces illuminated briefly by her flashlight. And they heard the boys whisper, "That's not my dad." Several jurors looked down. One pressed a hand to her mouth. The prosecution then built its case methodically. Forensic evidence from the residents, testimony from child psychologists who had evaluated the victims, digital evidence extracted from encrypted files, financial records mapping payments to co-conspirators, and the testimony of the children themselves, delivered via closed-circuit video so they would not have to face the man who had hurt them. 8 victims were identified in total, spanning 7 years. Each child had entered Devereaux's orbit through the family court system he controlled. Each had been selected for his mentorship program. Each had been placed in homes or facilities connected to people who answered to him. The defense attempted every available angle. They argued the children's testimony had been riven. The judge ruled the broken taillight and erratic driving provided clear, probable cause. They argued the children's testimony had been coached. Prosecution experts dismantled the claim, with forensic interview recordings showing open-ended, non-leading questioning. They claimed the digital evidence was circumstantial. Federal analysts walked the jury through file structures, timestamps, and encryption methods that proved deliberate concealment. A cooperating social worker took the stand and described in detail how Devereaux selected children and how she was too afraid of his power to refuse. Her voice broke once. She did not ask for sympathy. The jury gave her none. The jury deliberated for 1 day. Guilty on all 34 counts. The courtroom was still when the verdict was read. No gasps, no outbursts, just silence and the sound of the court clerk's voice moving through each count, one after another, the word guilty repeating like a hammer on stone. Devereaux sat motionless, hands flat on the table, eyes forward. His attorney closed his folder and said nothing. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. A senior federal judge was brought in from out of state to preside. Before the sentence was delivered, 3 of the older victims submitted impact statements. One was read aloud by a prosecutor because the victim could not speak without breaking down. The statement described years of abuse by someone the system told them to trust. Someone who wore a robe and sat above everyone else in the room. Someone who decided where children went and who they belonged to. The sentencing judge addressed Devereaux directly. You were entrusted with the most sacred responsibility the legal system can offer, the protection of children who had no one else to speak for them. You weaponized that trust. You used the institution designed to shield the most vulnerable members of this society as your personal instrument of predation. There is no sentence this court can impose that fully accounts for what you have taken from these children. Devereaux was sentenced to 67 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. He showed no visible emotion. At 58 years old, the sentence was effectively life. He was led from the courtroom in shackles, past the families of victims, past the journalists, past the cameras. He did not look at anyone. The door closed behind him. His robe, his title, his reputation, his freedom. All of it gone. The fallout reshaped Crestfield from the inside out. The State Judicial Conduct Board was restructured after an independent audit revealed systemic failures in handling complaints against sitting judges. 3 board members resigned. New legislation was introduced requiring independent oversight of all family court placements and mandatory cross-referencing of judicial involvement in foster care assignments. The county's child welfare department was placed under state supervision for a minimum of 5 years. Internal emails uncovered during the federal investigation showed that supervisors within the department had been aware of irregularities in Devereaux's placement recommendations, but chose not to act. One email sent from a senior case manager to the department director read simply, "He's the judge. We don't question the judge." That email was cited in the governor's public statement calling for wholesale reform. The 2 cooperating social workers received reduced sentences. One was given 3 years. The other received probation and mandatory testimony in related proceedings. The group home administrator who had facilitated access to children was sentenced to 12 years. Gloria Vance, the foster mother whose license had been revoked after she raised concerns, was publicly reinstated. The state issued a formal apology. She regained custody of the 2 children she had lost and was invited to serve on the newly formed Civilian Oversight Panel for Child Welfare. Officer Vanessa Cordero was recognized by the State Attorney General's office for her actions during the traffic stop. She declined all media interviews. A single quote appeared in an internal department memo distributed to every sheriff's office in the state. "I just did what the training says. If something doesn't feel right, you don't drive away from it." The Bodycam footage from Highway 9 was viewed over 4 million times in the weeks following the trial. Legal analysts, child advocacy organizations, and law enforcement training programs dissected it frame by frame. But the moment everyone returned to was the same. a dark highway, a flashlight beam sweeping across the back seat of a Lincoln Continental, 4 children sitting in silence, and a boy who turned his head, looked into the camera mounted on a deputy's chest, and whispered 5 words that broke the case open. "That's not my dad." Without that whisper, Devereaux might still be on the bench. Without Cordero's refusal to defer to a powerful man's title, the children might still be in his reach. Without the body cam preserving the truth in a format that could not be denied, rewritten, or buried, the system that protected him might never have been forced to answer for what it allowed. The children are in protective care. They are receiving long-term psychological support. The boy who spoke has not been publicly identified, and will not be. He is reported to be doing well. His name will not appear in this story because he has already done the bravest thing anyone could ask of him. He spoke when silence was safer, and someone listened. This case was brutal, but the case on the right spirals completely out of control.
Don't sit there acting confused. You expect me to believe this is your vehicle?
It is registered to me. You verified that.
Registered doesn't mean earned. Cars like this don't just land in the hands of someone like you without something shady behind it.
Am I being charged with a crime?
No.
At 9:47 on a quiet Sunday morning along Meridian Boulevard in Crestwood, a matte black Lamborghini Urus rolled through a green light at the intersection of Walnut and 5th. The driver signaled, changed lanes, and continued at exactly the posted speed limit. 6 car lengths behind her, Officer Brent Hargrove, 42, a 16-year veteran of the Crestwood Police Department, sat behind the wheel of his patrol cruiser and watched. His dash cam was running, his body camera was active. Both would later confirm what happened next. Hargrove followed the Lamborghini for 6 full blocks. He didn't activate his lights. He didn't run the plates. He just followed, watching, waiting for something he could use. At the 7th block, he hit the sirens. He called it in as a suspicious vehicle, possible stolen, and noted a failure to signal during a lane change. The dash cam would later show the signal blinking clearly, 3 full seconds before the merge. The driver who pulled over without hesitation placed both hands on the steering wheel and waited calmly for the officer to approach was federal judge Geneviève Okafor-Laurent. She was 53 years old, a sitting judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the 4th Circuit, and one of the most respected jurists in the federal system. She was on her way home from visiting her elderly mother across town. She wore a linen blouse, sunglasses pushed up on her head, and no identification that would mark her as anything other than what Hargrove had already decided she was: a black woman driving a car he didn't believe she could own. Officer Brent Hargrove had been with the Crestwood Police Department since he was 26 years old. In that time, he had accumulated 31 civilian complaints, the overwhelming majority filed by Black and Latino residents. The complaints described a pattern that never changed: pretextual stops, aggressive questioning, searches conducted without consent or probable cause, property seized and never returned. Hargrove had earned a nickname in the neighborhoods he patrolled most heavily. Residents called him the Collector. Not because he collected evidence, but because he collected belongings. Cash pulled from wallets during traffic stops, jewelry removed during pat-downs and logged as potential proceeds of criminal activity, electronics confiscated under civil asset forfeiture statutes that allowed police to take property without ever filing charges. Over the past 5 years alone, Hargrove had seized more than $340,000 in cash and personal property from citizens. Almost none of those seizures led to arrests. Almost none of that property was ever returned. 2 prior cases involving allegations of planted evidence had been quietly settled by the city before reaching trial. Internal Affairs had reviewed his file multiple times and closed every investigation without action. His supervisors described him in evaluations as assertive and proactive. The police union representative, a man Hargrove met for drinks twice a month, had personally intervened to block 3 separate disciplinary recommendations. Younger officers who questioned his methods were told to mind their own calls. Those who pushed further were transferred. Hargrove operated with the confidence of a man who had never once been held accountable. And on this Sunday morning, with his lights flashing behind a Lamborghini Urus on Meridian Boulevard, He had no reason to believe that was about to change. Judge Genevieve Okafor Laurent was not the kind of person who announced herself. She never had been. Her father, Chukwemeka Okafor, came to the United States from Lagos in 1974 with $200 and a work visa. He drove a taxi in Washington, D.C. for 31 years, 6 days a week, often pulling double shifts so his children wouldn't carry the debt he did. Her mother, Ruth Ann Laurent, grew up in Orangeburg, South Carolina, the granddaughter of sharecroppers. She cleaned office buildings at night and took community college classes during the day until her body gave out before her ambition did. Genevieve was the youngest of 3. She earned a full scholarship to Howard University, graduated summa cum laude, and was accepted to Yale Law School, where she was one of 9 black women in her class. She clerked for a Supreme Court justice. She spent a decade as a federal prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, trying cases involving police brutality, unlawful search and seizure, and systemic discrimination in law enforcement agencies across the Southeast. 9 years ago, she was appointed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. She had since authored or joined rulings in more than a dozen landmark cases involving police misconduct, qualified immunity, and constitutional violations under the 4th and 14th Amendments. Legal scholars described her opinions as surgically precise. Defense attorneys feared her bench. Civil rights lawyers cited her rulings like scripture. None of that was visible on Meridian Boulevard that morning. What Hargrove saw when he looked through that window was a black woman in a linen blouse sitting behind the wheel of a car he had already decided wasn't hers. And that was all he needed. Hargrove approached the driver's side with his right hand resting on his belt. His body camera captured the angle from his chest. The dash cam recorded the wider frame from the cruiser. Both were rolling. Both would preserve every word of what came next. He didn't greet her, didn't introduce himself. His first words were a demand. "Whose car is this?" Judge Okafor Laurent looked up at him, hands still on the wheel. "It's mine. You have proof of that?" She reached toward the center console slowly, movements deliberate and visible. "My license and registration are right here." Hargrove took the documents and studied them far longer than necessary, flipping the registration back and forth, holding the license up as though comparing the photo to a face he had already decided didn't match the vehicle. He walked back to his cruiser. He ran the plates. The vehicle came back registered to Genevieve Okafor Laurent. The license was valid. No warrants, no flags, nothing. He sat in the cruiser for nearly 4 minutes. Then he got out and walked back to her window. The body camera captured what came next without interruption. "Step out of the vehicle." "For what reason?" Okafor Laurent's voice was steady. "I need you to step out." "I've provided my documents. Everything is in order. Why am I being asked to exit my car?" Hargrove leaned closer. "I'm detecting the odor of marijuana coming from inside this vehicle." There was no marijuana in the car. There had never been marijuana in the car. Forensic analysis would later confirm that no trace of any controlled substance existed anywhere in or on the vehicle. But in that moment, on the side of Meridian Boulevard, with no witnesses yet watching and both cameras running, Hargrove had just manufactured the one claim he believed would give him the authority to go further. And he intended to. "Step out, now!" Judge Okafor Laurent opened the door slowly. She placed one foot on the pavement, then the other. She stood upright, hands visible at her sides, and spoke clearly enough for every microphone in range to capture it. "I am complying with your order under protest. I do not consent to any search of my person or my vehicle." Hargrove didn't acknowledge a single word. He took her by the arm and moved her to the rear quarter panel of the Lamborghini, positioning her against the car with both palms flat on the matte black paint. He patted her down with hands that moved too slowly and pressed too hard, running his palms along her sides, her waist, her pockets. She stood motionless, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the street ahead. A second patrol unit had already arrived. Officer Nolan Fitch, 29, 5 years on the force, stepped out and approached. Hargrove jerked his head toward the open driver's door. "Toss it."
Fitch hesitated. His eyes moved from the woman standing composed against a $250,000 vehicle to the registration document sitting clean on the hood. He opened his mouth like he was going to ask something, then didn't. He reached into the car. They emptied her purse across the hood. Wallet, reading glasses, a leather planner, a tube of hand cream, receipts.
They opened the glove compartment and pulled out the owner's manual and insurance papers. They lifted the floor mats. They searched the center console, the door pockets, the trunk. In the back seat, they found a small zippered bag containing her mother's prescription medications. Hargrove unzipped it, spread the bottles across the leather seat, read the labels one by one, then left them scattered where they fell. They found nothing illegal, because there was nothing illegal to find. Across the street, in a second-floor window of a brick colonial, a woman named Celeste Gerard had been watching since the lights first flashed. Her phone was recording. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Hargrove stood in the middle of the road, feet apart, hands on his hips, staring at the open doors of a vehicle that had given him nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no contraband. No justification for a single thing he had done in the last 20 minutes. The body camera on his chest kept recording. He turned back toward Judge Okafor-Laurent, still standing where he had placed her, palms flat against the side of the car, and what came out of his mouth next would be replayed in federal court, in news broadcasts, in training seminars, and in living rooms across the country. Let me ask you something. A woman like you, driving something like this, how does that happen? She said nothing. He stepped closer. Did your boyfriend buy this for you? Some rapper? Some dealer? Because I've been doing this a long time, and cars like this don't end up with people like you unless something dirty is going on. His voice was casual, almost conversational, as if he were stating something so obvious it barely needed saying. This car costs more than you'd make in 10 years, so I'm going to ask you again, where did the money come from? Okafor-Laurent turned her head slightly. Am I free to leave? Hargrove's expression hardened. You'll leave when I decide you can leave, not before. Angle. A second neighbor, 2 houses down. Angle. A second neighbor, 2 houses down, had stepped onto his porch and started filming. A passing driver slowed at the intersection, window down, phone raised. 3 cameras were now recording from 3 directions, and the body camera on Hargrove's chest made 4. None of them would miss a word of what had already been said, and Hargrove, standing in the middle of Meridian Boulevard, with his chest out and his badge catching the morning sun, had no idea that every syllable was building the federal case that would end him. There was a moment, captured clearly on the body camera, where Judge Okafor-Laurent's eyes moved from Hargrove's face to the badge on his chest and then back again. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but lawyers who reviewed the footage later would describe it as the moment she made her decision. She could have ended it right there. 1 sentence. I'm a federal judge on the 4th Circuit Court of Appeals. The stop would have collapsed on itself. Hargrove would have stammered. Fitch would have frozen. Apologies would have tumbled out, fast and hollow and desperate. She knew that. She also knew exactly what that would mean. It would mean that the Constitution applied differently depending on who you were. That rights were not rights at all, but privileges extended to people with titles and revoked from everyone else. That a black woman driving a Lamborghini deserved to be searched and humiliated, unless she could prove she was important enough to be left alone. So she said nothing about who she was. Instead, she asked for his badge number. Hargrove stared at her. What? Your badge number. I'd like it, please. He recited it with reluctance, each digit clipped and hard. She repeated it back to confirm. Then she asked him to spell his last name. He sneered. Hargrove. Slow enough for you? She didn't react. She filed it the way she filed everything, with precision, without emotion, with the patience of a woman who had spent 9 years on the federal bench, weighing testimony, dissecting evidence, and holding powerful men accountable when they believed they were untouchable. She had judged cases exactly like this one. She had read transcripts full of the same language, the same pretexts, the same arrogance dressed in a uniform. Now she was standing inside one, palms flat against her own car, living every word she had ever read in a case file. Hargrove keyed his radio. "I need a K-9 unit at my location, Meridian Boulevard, south of 5th. Judge Okafor-Laurent looked at him but said nothing. The temperature that morning was already 87 degrees and climbing. She was standing on asphalt in direct sunlight with no shade and no water. In the backseat of the Lamborghini, her mother's prescription medications sat in the zippered bag Hargrove had torn open, bottles scattered across dark leather that was absorbing every degree of heat the sun could give it. 2 of those prescriptions were temperature sensitive. The labels said so clearly. Hargrove had read those labels. He didn't care. The K-9 unit arrived 28 minutes later. Officer Dean Sutcliffe, 36, stepped out with a Belgian Malinois on a short lead. The dog circled the vehicle once, then again. It showed no alert behavior. No sit, no paw, no change in breathing or posture. Sutcliffe looked at Hargrove. "I'm not getting anything." Hargrove shook his head. He paused near the rear quarter. "That's a partial alert. Go again." Sutcliffe glanced at Fitch. Fitch looked at the ground. Neither of them believed what Hargrove had just said, and the body camera caught the look between them clearly. Sutcliffe walked the dog around a third time. Nothing. Hargrove ordered the vehicle searched again. Fitch opened the rear hatch and moved things that had already been moved. Sutcliffe stood to the side, leash in hand, silent. Fitch spoke quietly, barely audible on the body camera audio, but recovered during forensic enhancement. "Maybe we should wrap this up." Hargrove didn't turn around. "Shut up and finish." By the time it was over, 57 minutes had passed since the initial stop. 57 minutes for a lane change that was executed legally. 57 minutes that produced no citation, no charge, no arrest, and no apology. Hargrove handed back her documents without a word. Judge Okafor-Laurent gathered the medication bottles from the back seat, now warm to the touch. She noticed the scuff on the driver's seat leather where Fitch had leaned his tool belt. She sat down, closed the door, and pulled away from the curb at exactly the speed limit. She did not look back. Hargrove watched the Lamborghini disappear down Meridian Boulevard and returned to his cruiser. He logged the stop as a routine traffic contact with no further action. He had no idea that the woman he had just spent an hour degrading would by morning have the full weight of the federal government bearing down on him with the force his badge had never prepared him for. At 7:15 Monday morning, Judge Geneviève Okafor-Laurent sat at her desk in her home office with a legal pad, a pen, and a phone. She did not call the Crestwood Police Department. She did not file a civilian complaint. She did not leave a message with Internal Affairs. She called the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. She identified herself by name and title. She provided her case number from the Fourth Circuit, her judicial appointment reference, and a detailed oral account of the stop, timed to the minute, citing the specific constitutional violations by amendment and clause. She then called the FBI field office and made the same report. Then the Office of Inspector General. Each call was precise, measured, and without emotion. She spoke the way she wrote opinions. Facts first, law second, conclusions last. By 8:30 a.m., she had submitted a written account, 7 pages, single-spaced, with timestamps drawn from her own memory and cross-referenced against the time she had noted on the dashboard clock during the stop. She requested preservation of all footage, Hargrove's dash cam, his body camera, Fitch's body camera, and the K-9 unit's records. She requested Hargrove's personnel file, his stop history, and his civil asset forfeiture records. Then she made one more call. Not to an agency, but to a civil rights litigation firm with a national reputation for police misconduct cases. She told them she was not calling for herself. She was calling because she wanted to know how many other people Brent Hargrove had done this to. People who didn't have a law degree. People who didn't have a title. People who didn't have the ability to make the calls she had just made. By the time Judge Okafor-Laurent closed her legal pad, the machinery of federal accountability was already turning, and Officer Brent Hargrove was on his way to work with no idea that his name was now in 3 federal databases. The footage arrived at the DOJ Civil Rights Division by secure transfer on Tuesday. Investigators reviewed every second from 4 separate sources. The dash cam came first. It showed the Lamborghini Urus approaching the intersection of Walnut and 5th, signaling a lane change 3 full seconds before merging and completing the maneuver cleanly within the posted speed limit. The failure to signal that Hargrove had used as his pretext for the stop had never occurred. The body camera footage was worse. It captured Hargrove's tone from the first word, the immediate demand to know whose car it was, the prolonged examination of documents that were in perfect order.
Every one of them. Women like you don't. Every one of them. Women like you don't come by cars like this. Did your boyfriend buy it for you? This car costs more than you'd make in 10 years. Audio forensic enhancement recovered something the body camera microphone had barely caught in real time. Early in the stop, before Fitch had arrived, Hargrove had leaned toward his radio and whispered, "Bet you anything this thing's stolen or bought with dirty money. Look at her." The K-9 unit's records collapsed the marijuana claim entirely. Officer Sutcliffe, under questioning, admitted the dog had shown no genuine alert behavior at any point during the search. When asked about the partial alert Hargrove had claimed, Sutcliffe paused for a long time before answering. "There was no alert. I told him that. He said to go again." Investigators then pulled Hargrove's stop records. In the past 18 months, he had conducted 214 traffic stops. 178 of them, over 83%, involved Black or Latino drivers. Civil asset forfeiture filings showed he had seized more than $340,000 in cash and personal property during that same period. Charges were filed in fewer than 6% of those seizures. The rest of the property simply disappeared into the system, and the people it belonged to never saw it again. The investigators looked at the numbers, looked at the footage, and understood they were no longer investigating a single traffic stop. They were looking at a career. They arrived at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday without warning. 2 FBI special agents and 3 DOJ Civil Rights Division investigators walked through the front entrance of the Crestwood Police Department, carrying federal subpoenas and a preservation order for all digital records. They did not ask for a meeting. They served the documents at the front desk and requested immediate access to the Chief of Police. Chief Raymond Beckett, 58, came out of his office expecting a courtesy visit. His expression changed within 30 seconds. The subpoenas demanded Hargrove's complete personnel file, all 31 complaint records, every internal affairs investigation and its disposition, body camera server access logs going back 3 years, and all internal communications referencing Hargrove's stop activity, forfeiture records, or civilian complaints. Beckett's first instinct was to push back. He began asking about jurisdiction, about process, about whether the department's legal counsel should be present. The lead FBI agent let him finish, then told him the victim of the stop was a sitting judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. The color left Beckett's face, but the agent continued before the silence could settle. "Her title is not why we're here. We're here because the evidence shows a pattern in practice of civil rights violations by an officer your department has protected for 16 years. That's a federal matter, regardless of who he pulled over last Sunday." Hargrove was on patrol when the call came through ordering him back to the station. He was met in the parking lot by a captain who told him to hand over his badge, his firearm, and his cruiser keys. He was escorted inside, placed in an administrative office, and informed he was suspended pending a federal investigation. His face went tight. He asked what this was about. Nobody answered. Fitch was pulled from duty the same morning and placed on administrative leave. The union representative, Victor Spano, arrived within the hour, demanding to know what was happening. An FBI agent took him aside and said one sentence that ended the conversation. "Obstruction of a federal civil rights investigation is a felony, Mr. Spano. I suggest you cooperate fully and advise your client to do the same." Spano said nothing further. For the first time in 16 years, the machinery that had shielded Brent Hargrove went completely silent.
3 weeks later, the United States Attorney's Office for the District filed a federal indictment against Officer Brent Hargrove. The charges were severe: deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. Section 242, conspiracy to commit civil rights violations, filing false police reports, illegal search and seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment. The indictment ran 34 pages. It did not focus solely on the stop of Judge Genevieve Okafor-Laurent. It detailed a pattern spanning years. 47 identified victims, predominantly Black and Latino, subjected to unlawful stops, fabricated pretexts, warrantless searches, and civil asset forfeitures carried out without probable cause. It described a system in which complaints were filed and buried. Supervisors looked the other way, and one officer operated with impunity because no one above him had the will to stop him. Officer Nolan Fitch was offered cooperation terms within days of the indictment. He accepted. In his testimony to federal investigators, Fitch described what Hargrove was like between stops, the language he used in the cruiser when the body cameras were off, the casual way he selected targets based on race and vehicle type, the comments about certain neighborhoods and certain people that had become so routine, Fitch stopped registering them as unusual. He described an unwritten culture within the department where aggressive stop numbers were rewarded, where complaints from minority residents were treated as the cost of doing business, and where officers who raised concerns were quietly reassigned or frozen out of advancement. Fitch's testimony led investigators to two supervisors, Sergeant Dale Womack and Lieutenant Ira Fontaine, both of whom were named in the indictment as unindicted co-conspirators. Internal emails showed Womack had received at least 9 forwarded complaints about Hargrove over 4 years and had closed every one without action. Fontaine had signed off on Hargrove's forfeiture paperwork dozens of times, without once questioning the absence of corresponding charges. Neither man had been careless. They had been deliberate, and the federal government intended to prove it. The trial began on a Tuesday in a federal courtroom 40 miles from Crestwood. Hargrove's defense attorney opened with a simple argument. His client was a veteran officer who followed his training, trusted his instincts, and made judgment calls the way officers did every day. He called it experience. He asked the jury to consider the pressures of the job. The prosecution responded by pressing play. The body camera footage from the Lamborghini stop ran first. The jury watched from Hargrove's own perspective as he fabricated a marijuana claim, emptied a purse across the hood, scattered prescription medication across a back seat, and told a woman standing against her own car that people like her didn't come by vehicles like this. Then prosecutors played footage from 6 other stops, different days, different drivers. The language was nearly identical. The tactics were the same. Each stop involved a Black or Latino driver. Each produced no charges. 12 of Hargrove's other victims took the stand. A retired canine training supervisor testified that no alert behavior had occurred during the Lamborghini search, and that the partial alert Hargrove claimed did not exist in any recognized training program. A use of force expert testified that every element of the search violated the Fourth Amendment. Judge Okafor-Laurent took the stand last. She was introduced by name alone. To have a stranger's hands press her. To have a stranger's hands press her against her own vehicle. What it felt like to watch her mother's medication scattered across hot leather by a man who never once considered she might be telling the truth. She described the moment Hargrove told her the car cost more than she'd make in 10 years, and she paused. Not for effect, because the memory required it. The jury deliberated for less than a day, guilty on every count. The sentencing hearing was held 3 weeks later. Hargrove stood in a dark suit, no badge, no firearm. The presiding judge, the Honorable Catherine Shao, addressed him directly. Officer Hargrove, you did not merely break the law, you weaponized it. You used the authority entrusted to you to target, humiliate, and rob citizens of their constitutional rights based on the color of their skin. You did this repeatedly, systematically, and without remorse. She sentenced him to 7 years in federal prison, among the harshest sentences for a civil rights violation by a law enforcement officer in the circuit's recent history. He was remanded immediately. Fitch received a suspended sentence for cooperation, but was permanently barred from law enforcement. His silence on Meridian Boulevard had cost him everything his testimony couldn't buy back. The Crestwood Police Department entered a federal consent decree, independent civilian oversight, mandatory demographic data on all stops and forfeitures, published quarterly, comprehensive retraining with annual testing, complete overhaul of internal affairs, including independent review of all racial bias complaints. Sergeant Womack and Lieutenant Fontaine were forced to resign. Chief Beckett announced his retirement 2 days later without public comment. The civil lawsuit was filed on behalf of Judge Okafor Laurent and 38 other identified victims. The city's attorneys reviewed the footage, the stop data, the forfeiture records, the emails, and the federal conviction. Settlement negotiations lasted less than a month. The final amount was $6.4 million, divided among victims according to severity and documentation. The money would matter, but what mattered more was the record. It could not be sealed, it could not be buried, and it could not be undone. Judge Genevieve Okafor Laurent returned to the bench without ceremony. She did not give interviews. She did not appear on panels about her experience. She let the record speak because the record was comprehensive and the record was permanent. But 6 months after the trial, she accepted an invitation to deliver the keynote address at a national legal conference on constitutional policing.
She stood at the podium in the same composure she had carried on Meridian Boulevard and said what she had carried quietly since that Sunday morning.
I did not tell that officer who I was, because who I am should not determine whether my rights are respected. The Constitution does not have a VIP lane. The room was silent for a long moment before the applause began. She used a portion of her civil settlement to fund a legal clinic specializing in representation for victims of discriminatory traffic stops, people who had been searched, seized from, humiliated, and sent on their way without charges, without apology, and without anyone to call on Monday morning. The clinic opened in a small office 12 minutes from Meridian Boulevard. Hargrove served his sentence in a federal facility where his former profession made every day harder than the last. He never issued a public apology. He never acknowledged wrongdoing. He maintained until the end that he had been doing his job. After the settlement. Traffic stop racial. After the settlement. Traffic stop racial disparities across the department had dropped by 61%. Complaints of discriminatory enforcement had fallen by more than half. Officers now recorded justification for every stop in writing, and every recording was subject to independent review. In the Oversight Board's office, mounted on the wall behind the conference table, hung a single framed image. It was a still captured from Hargrove's own body camera. It showed Judge Okafor Laurent standing beside her matte black Lamborghini